Clothes were not invented because humans were cold. I know that's what you've been told. I know it seems obvious. Ice age, cold weather, animal skins, problem solved. But here's the problem with that story. Anatomically, modern humans existed for over 100,000 years before they started wearing clothes. 100,000 years of ice, snow, glaciers, and temperatures that would end you in hours. And they weren't wearing anything. So cold wasn't the trigger. Something else was. And once you find out what it actually was, you'll never look at getting dressed the same way again. Let's start with a number. 300,000. That's roughly how many years ago Homo sapiens first appeared. We know this from fossil evidence, from sites in Morocco, from genetic data that has been refined and re-refined over decades of increasingly sophisticated analysis. 300,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans walked out of the African landscape looking more or less like us. Same skull shape, same body proportions, same basic neurological hardware, not primitive drafts of humans, actual humans, and they were naked, completely, entirely, unremarkably naked, because nakedness wasn't a condition for them, it was just existence. It was the default state of every living thing. Nobody had ever worn anything. The concept didn't exist. Now here's the thing that should make you stop. The first major ice age that humans genuinely had to contend with, the kind of cold that would have made clothing not just useful but apparently necessary for survival, began around 110,000 years ago. And the best scientific estimate for when humans first started wearing clothes is somewhere between 170,000 and 83,000 years ago. Which means one of two things is true. Either humans started wearing clothes before the cold got serious, which makes the cold weather story almost completely backwards, or they started wearing clothes right around the same time the cold arrived, in which case cold was maybe a factor, but probably not the original one. Because here's what the evidence actually shows. And the evidence, as it so often is with ancient human behavior, comes from a completely unexpected source: lice. Specifically, the evolutionary divergence between head lice and body lice. Stay with me, because this is one of the most genuinely elegant pieces of scientific detective work in all of archaeology, and it involves parasites, which automatically makes it more interesting. Head lice, Pediculus humanus capitis, live in human hair. They have been living in human hair for a very, very long time, millions of years in fact, long before we were even human. Our primate ancestors had them. We inherited them. They are deeply, uncomfortably ancient passengers on the human journey. Body lice, Pediculus humanus corporis, are different. Body lice live not in hair, but in clothing, specifically in the fibers of clothing, close to the skin. And here's what makes them scientifically extraordinary. Body lice evolved from head lice. They are the same species, essentially, except that at some point in history, a population of head lice colonized a new habitat. That habitat was clothing, which means body lice could not have existed before clothing existed. They are, in the most literal biological sense, a byproduct of the invention of clothes. So researchers asked a very specific question. When did head lice and body lice diverge? When did that population split happen? And the answer, derived from molecular clock analysis, essentially calculating how long it takes for genetic mutations to accumulate at a known rate and working backwards, placed the divergence at somewhere between 170,000 and 83,000 years ago. That is your window. That is when clothing appeared. Not because someone wrote it down, not because we found a shirt preserved in amber, because the parasites that moved in when the shirt was invented left a genetic record that has survived everything else. The clothing rotted, the lice stayed, and their DNA told us everything. Now let's talk about where this happened. Because 170,000 to 83,000 years ago, humans were in Africa, not in Europe, not anywhere near an ice age in the traditional sense. Africa, under a sun that has never once in the history of the Earth been described as the problem. So why were African humans living in a warm climate, putting things on their bodies? What were they solving for? This is where the story takes a turn that most people have genuinely never considered. And it starts not with survival. It starts with something much more human than that. It starts with parasites again, but a different kind, specifically ectoparasites. Ticks, mites, biting flies, mosquitoes, the kind of things that land on exposed skin and either bite you, burrow into you, lay eggs on you, or give you diseases that kill you slowly. In the African savannah 100,000 years ago, this was not a minor inconvenience. This was a constant, relentless biological assault. Every day, every night, every exposed inch of skin was a target. And here's something that most people don't know about human skin specifically. We lost our fur somewhere between 1.2 million and 700,000 years ago. Our ancestors shed the dense body hair that every other primate still has, which was brilliant for thermoregulation. Sweating to cool down works dramatically better on bare skin than on fur. But it came at a cost. It left us exposed. Every other primate has a natural barrier between their skin and the environment. We removed ours. We became the naked ape. And in a landscape absolutely teeming with insects and parasites, that nakedness was a liability. The first coverings may not have been clothes in any sense we'd recognise. They may have been hides draped loosely over the shoulders to keep flies off, leaves wrapped around the torso, plant fibres tied around the waist. Not sewn, not fitted, not designed, just placed. A barrier, a boundary between skin and the world, protective in the most immediate, practical sense. And if that sounds underwhelming, if you expected the invention of clothes to be more dramatic, consider what it actually meant. For the first time in the history of life on this planet, a living creature was deliberately modifying the boundary between its body and its environment. Not claws, not fur, not a shell that grew. A thing, an external object, deliberately placed. That is not nothing. That is in fact one of the most significant behavioural leaps in the entire evolutionary record. The beginning of the human relationship with the made world. The moment we started building our environment rather than just living inside it. But here's where it gets genuinely complicated. Because clothing didn't stay practical for long, or rather, it was never only practical. And this is the part of the story that the cold weather narrative completely erases because it reduces a profoundly complex human behaviour to a simple engineering solution. Humans needed warmth. Humans found fur. Problem solved. Move on. But that's not what happened. What happened is far stranger and far more revealing about what we actually are as a species. Around 75,000 to 100,000 years ago, something happened in the archaeological record that researchers call the behavioural revolution, or sometimes the cognitive revolution, or sometimes the Great Leap Forward, though that term has fallen out of favour because it implies things happen more suddenly than they probably did. Whatever you call it, the pattern is the same. Suddenly, humans started doing things they had never done before. They started making art. They started making jewellery. They started using symbolic pigments, painting themselves and their tools with ochre, a red-orange iron oxide that has no practical function whatsoever. It doesn't make a spear fly straighter. It doesn't preserve food. It doesn't repel insects. It just looks a certain way. It signals something. It means something. And around this same period, the evidence for clothing becomes richer and more consistent. Clothing and symbolic thinking appear to have arrived together. That is not a coincidence. That is a deeply important correlation, because it suggests that from a very early point, clothing was never just about protection. It was about identity. It was about communication. Think about what clothing actually does beyond the purely physical. It covers parts of the body. It reveals other parts. It can display status, group membership, ritual significance, sexual availability, spiritual belief. It can mark you as belonging or as different. It can make you look more dangerous, more approachable, more powerful, more sacred. Every human society ever documented, without a single exception, wears some form of body covering. And in every single one of those societies, the covering means something beyond its physical function. The specific meaning changes completely from culture to culture. But the fact of meaning, the fact that what you put on your body communicates something, is universal, which means it was probably there from the beginning. The first human who draped a hide over their shoulder wasn't just blocking flies. They were doing something else too, something they might not have been able to articulate, something that was just beginning to exist as a possibility in the human mind. The idea that you could choose how you appeared, that your body didn't have to just be what it was, that you could add to it, change it, present it. That is not a practical thought, that is a profoundly abstract one. Art, religion, language, culture, all of it begins in some sense with the moment a human looked at their own body and thought, I could change this. Let's talk about the needle, because the needle is where the story shifts from draping hides to actually making clothes. And the needle is one of the most underrated inventions in human history. We found bone needles, tiny, precisely crafted with deliberately drilled eyes, dating back at least 50,000 years in multiple locations across Europe and Asia. Some researchers believe they're older than that, possibly much older, in Africa. These weren't accidents. Drilling a hole through a thin piece of bone, small enough for sinew to pass through, using stone tools, requires a level of fine motor control, patience, and conceptual planning that is genuinely staggering. You have to understand that the hole serves a function the needle alone can't serve. You have to plan backwards from an imagined end state. The needle is small. What the needle represents is enormous. It means someone sat down with a piece of bone and a stone tool and worked for hours, probably, to produce an object that would let them join pieces of hide together into a fitted garment. Not a draped covering, a garment, something shaped to the body, something constructed with intention. And fitted clothing changes everything, because fitted clothing is warm in a way that draped hides simply are not. Fitted clothing traps air against the skin. It moves with the body. It stays in place. The difference between a hide thrown over your shoulders and a sewn fitted garment is not incremental. It is the difference between partial protection and actual thermal regulation, which means that the moment humans developed the technology to sew, they unlock the ability to survive in climates that would have been completely inaccessible to them before, and they used it. The archaeological and genetic record of human expansion is very clear on this point. The migration of anatomically modern humans into Northern Europe and Central Asia happens after the development of sophisticated clothing technology. Not before. They didn't go north and then figure out how to stay warm. They figured out how to stay warm, and then they went north. Clothing didn't just protect humans from the cold, it expanded the habitable world. Every frozen landscape our ancestors ever walked into, they walked into wearing something someone had made. The clothes came first. The conquest of the cold came second. But here's the detail that nobody talks about, the detail that is simultaneously the most practical and the most disturbing element of this entire story. When humans started wearing animal hides, they didn't just cover themselves in warmth, they covered themselves in a habitat. A warm, moist, body temperature microenvironment pressed directly against their skin, which is, from the perspective of certain organisms, paradise. This is where body lice came from, as we discussed, but lice were not the only things that moved in. Early clothing, particularly untreated hides, was a breeding ground for a remarkable variety of organisms that found the warm, dark space between fabric and skin to be an ideal home. Managing this, keeping clothing clean enough to be wearable and not a vector for disease, was not a trivial problem. Some researchers have argued that the development of methods for treating hides, scraping them, smoking them, working them with fat and brains to preserve them and kill parasites, was as significant a technological development as the needle itself. Because clothing that was never treated wouldn't stay wearable for long. It would harden, crack, smell unbearably, and host a small ecosystem of things you did not want living against your skin. The people who figured out how to prevent this, who developed the knowledge of how to prepare a hide properly, held genuinely valuable knowledge, specialized knowledge, the kind of knowledge that gets passed down deliberately, taught, preserved. And here you have one of the earliest examples of a human skill set so valuable it becomes a craft, becomes a role, eventually becomes an industry. The entire global textile industry, which in the modern world is worth over $1 trillion annually and employs hundreds of millions of people, traces its origins to someone sitting with a fresh hide and working out how to make it last. Now let's zoom out, because there's a philosophical dimension to the invention of clothing that almost never gets discussed, and that I think is the most interesting part of this entire story. When humans started wearing clothes, they did something that no other species has ever done in quite the same way. They began to exist in two layers simultaneously. The biological layer, the actual body with its actual needs, its actual vulnerabilities, its actual signals. And the cultural layer, the presented body, the chosen appearance, the deliberate modification of how the biological layer is perceived by others. Every other animal is only one thing. A peacock's tail is part of the peacock. A lion's mane is part of the lion. They cannot choose to have it or not have it. They cannot take it off. They cannot change it based on context or audience. Humans can. Humans do, every single day. You put on different things for different situations, different things for different people, different things for different versions of yourself you want to present to the world. You have been doing this so automatically for so long that you probably never think about it. But think about it now. The version of you that exists in public is a construction. A deliberate, curated, chosen presentation of self that is layered on top of the biological you underneath. And that construction began 100,000 years ago in Africa, with a piece of hide and a practical problem that turned out to have an identity answer. Clothing was the first technology that was also a language, the first human invention that communicated not just function but meaning. That said, not just I am protected, but I am this kind of person. I belong to this group. I carry this status. I hold this belief. Every piece of clothing that has ever existed, from a Paleolithic hide to a tailored suit to a Supreme hoodie to a wedding dress, is a sentence in that language. The vocabulary has changed completely. The grammar has evolved beyond recognition. But the language itself, the fundamental act of using what you wear to communicate who you are, that has never changed. That started 100,000 years ago and has never stopped for a single generation since. Here's what we know. The cold didn't start it. Protection from insects and the elements probably did. Symbolic thinking and identity expression almost certainly joined immediately after. The needle transformed it from covering to construction. And the moment humans could construct their own appearance, the moment the body became something that could be added to, modified, presented differently to different people in different contexts, something shifted in the human story that never shifted back. We became the only species that gets dressed in the morning, the only species that can look in a mirror or a still pool of water 100,000 years ago and make a choice about how to appear. The only species for whom the question of what to wear is not just practical, but personal, not just physical, but philosophical. The oldest humans who ever lived woke up in the African morning and started figuring out what to put on, not because they had to, because they had started to understand something, that what you show the world is not the same thing as what you are. And that the gap between those two things, that space between skin and surface, between body and presentation, is where human culture lives. That gap is where everything we've ever made, everything we've ever believed, everything we've ever told each other about who we are came from. We've been filling it ever since.